Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is going to be a video covering the Ziigaat Odyssey 2 and where I place these on my wallhack certified tier list. This is a really nice feeling premium IEM from Ziigaat in this price range because of its CNC'd aluminum chassis, which is a little bit different than the 3D printed resin on a lot of IEMs in their line. It does feel very good in the hand, and the faceplate is a beautiful sparkly blue and silver with the Ziigaat branding. It comes with a 2-pin interchangeable cable here out of the box, and the cable's actually pretty nice, but I would just note that the green on the cable does not quite match up to the aqua colored blue on the faceplate. So I would just point that out, but it is a nice cable. You've got an interchangeable 3.5 and 4.4 out of the box, and it does come with a set of extra filters here in case you have an issue with your nozzles. I would point out as well that the new carrying case from Ziigaat is really nice. It's a nice brown, light brown toned color, tons of room inside, and you can see you've got a set of foam tips, 2 different sets of silicone tips, and I actually really like this new set of silicone tip that is included in the box. Pretty nice package overall, particularly at this price point. But the tuning, just objectively speaking, you can see it next to a few IEMs, next to the Mangird Tea Pro, next to the Zen's Top as well that I recently reviewed. And it does follow that new meta tuning. And the meta tuning isn't necessarily something that's really crossed into the higher thresholds for me for gaming. So although it might be something that seems very popular in the audiophile market right now, it's just not something that really hits for me in the higher categories on my wallhack certified tier list. I would say, like, I think overall these do outperform the Zen's Top Pro for me, not for music, but for gaming, and I'll get into a little bit of why. But when you look at the graph, the sub-bass region on this particular IEM in comparison to the Zen's Top Pro, it's actually just a bit cleaner in its attack and decay. It doesn't have this voluminous, energetic sub-bass that comes out of the Zen's Top Pro. Now for music, like that's what I'm looking for out of that region. But in game, I want a little bit of a cleaner bass region, and these do come off a little bit more natural, although still having quite a bit of punch in that lower end region. These just come off a little bit cleaner in game. So what you can expect out of that, for instance, in Valorant, the Vandal and certain audio cues, and even the thockier footsteps come off a little bit tighter in game in comparison to that emphasized energetic bass region. I would say though that still gunfire does ring through quite emphasized. So those are some of the targeted things that you do hear in the mix on most games, and particularly Apex having the biggest issue with this type of a tuning, usually just having issues with separation and layering in that realm of gunfire. I would say though that for the most part, the experience on these, the imaging separation are things that do highlight quite well and perform quite well. We'll get into a few things in each title, but overall that bass being pretty tight and clean, the separation and layering, I would say, performs quite well in most titles on the Ziigaat Odyssey 2. One of the things I would say is, like, out of this type of tuning, for gaming related purposes, you've got quite a number of options now that have just flooded the market. The Crinier options, the Meta, I thought was a pretty solid performer as well in certain titles. I also have the Nice Hack Rockies that I'll be reviewing here shortly. And we just looked at, again, the Zen's Top Pro in comparison, but these are, of course, I think about half the price, or around 150. Yeah, I think about half the price of the Zen's Top Pro. But let's get into how they perform in Call of Duty, Apex, CS2, and Valorant. Starting with Valorant, what I'll say is this does feel like a little bit more of a natural set than what we just looked at with the Zen's Top Pro. It still has this element of punch on the low end and this emphasis on the low end, and you hear that even with your own footsteps. They feel a little bit thockier as they're coming through and a little bit more prevalent, and that does detract from some things like picking up on the lighter taps. But one thing I will say is that the low end is cleaner on attack and decay in terms of the gunfire. So where the Zen's Top Pro just has this just massive amounts of energy in the low end with the sub bass and this rumble that really provides this tactility to it in Valorant, it's more of this natural yet punchy experience on the Odyssey 2. it makes for a environment that feels a little less intimate than the Zen's Top Pro. So the imaging on gunfire and things like that around the map does feel a little bit better, in my opinion, on this than the Zen's Top Pro. What I will say, though, is you lose a little bit of this sense of tactility as somebody's about to cross from behind a wall or as they are approaching you from depth. The general imaging is there, but it just loses out a little bit on like when precisely somebody is inching ever so closer to the edge of a wall and they're about to peek. That helps when there are two people, for instance, pushing you at the same time at different angles, and you're trying to focus on like who you need to pay attention to first. What's the most urgent threat? So I would detract a point there. Again, general imaging is great. I had a easy time picking up on gunfire around the map and where people were walking. What I would say, though, is like the lighter taps could shine through a little bit more on this set, especially, again, when there is a lot of gunfire. So separation and layering, although good, and that attack and decay on the base does feel good for Valorant, it could be a little bit better in massive team fights. But overall, I am going to be scoring this a B+ for Val. Again, it feels like a fairly natural set. Like I wouldn't necessarily classify it as warm, but you do pick up that emphasis on your footsteps, your audio cues, and the gunfire around the map, and certain abilities as well. Now, when we move to Apex, we just saw with the Zen's Top Pro performed pretty poorly. There's just too much of that deer in the headlights feeling as everything is going on in terms of abilities with that low-end rumble, as well as gunfire being very prevalent as well. This set actually does perform better than the Zen's Top Pro in Apex. I had an easier time during massive gunfights and picking up on certain audio cues, but gunfire is still very prevalent and a lot of abilities going off. You do get a lot of obstruction in being able to hear things clearly, just this cleanliness, this breathability in the space, but it is better than the Zen's Top Pro in that regard. So like a general 3v3, I didn't really have any issues at all, and that's definitely like step one in a good direction for Apex. I didn't really find the space to feel like as intimate as it does as well on the Zen's Top Pro. There's a little bit more of this cleanliness throughout the space, making things kind of disperse a little bit more. So less of that deer in the headlights feeling in massive fights. But when you do throw in a third party, again, you do have a more significant separation and layering issue. General imaging was great. Verticality, people going up zips, etc., felt good. And I do think that in fights, it was easier to pick up on imaging in comparison to the Zen's Top Pro. So again, a set that does sound rather like mild V shape in Apex, but you do have that extra boost in gunfire, which detracts from separation and layering in gunfights. And then you also do have a little bit of extra heft to abilities as well. So for Apex, though, I would score it around a B, and I am going to say that it is a higher B, a higher ranking than something like the Zen's Top Pro. So it does perform pretty well. Like I would say B bordering B+ on this set for Apex. In Counter-Strike 2, I also did find that the imaging felt better than it did on the Zen's Top Pro. There is a easier read on gunfire around the map with kind of like a greater sense of depth and positioning. But I will say that I do think the overall audio cues, again, for lighter taps could shine through a little bit more. So a lot of the footsteps on certain types of like gravelly materials in terms of that audio feedback, that audio cue could come through better and more clear. I do think that gunfire is still very prevalent and that the depth read could still be a little bit better on gunfire as well. But I would be placing these higher in CS2 than the Zen's Top Pro as well. I think separation and layering were fine in CS2. People shooting ops and a few AKs going off at the same time. I didn't really have much of an issue picking up on different things and their general positioning. Again, I do think that general imaging, though, at depth could be a little bit better. Almost like you want that space to remain fairly clean and those impacts to come through like a spotlight. I just lose that effect on this set in comparison to something like the Astrals or the Mangird Tea Pro, but still performing very good in terms of general imaging, separation, layering. I do think that they performed pretty good for CS2. In COD, it definitely does come off as a little bit of a warmer set, and that's because a lot of the things just come off with this additional husk, almost like all of the audio cues, your footsteps, slides, etc. But the things that really shine through are people kicking through doors. A lot of the gunfire around the map is very well placed in terms of imaging and depth perception. The separation and layering actually fantastic during airstrikes, mortar strikes, etc. Like you get this extra energetic punch in the low end, but it doesn't really become anything that muddles or bloats or covers up anything else. So footsteps still come through very well during those things, and taps in other buildings, etc. The one thing is like gunfire from my perspective, the gunfire can feel ever so slightly obstructive at times in fights when you start adding additional elements, etc. A little bit of a separation and layering hit there. But I do think that with the Treyarch mix, these do perform very well in Call of Duty. Again, imaging throughout the map, separating and demarcating like people above me, below me, in buildings, and how many different sets of footsteps there are, the general imaging in that vicinity, I do think is covered actually very well. So think like warmer, a little bit energetic on the low end, but something that still performs very well in Call of Duty. Like all the essential elements coming through quite nicely. The only thing is, like during gunfire, during certain impacts, some of the lighter things like people flying in parachutes sometimes doesn't really shine through with like a nice spotlighted effect. So every so often I notice like rotating to those things a little bit late. But overall, the space does sound quite wide and deep. The imaging depth perception, very good. A set that does perform well for Call of Duty, and I would give it a B+. So guys, that is going to be it for my gaming impressions on the Ziigaat Odyssey 2. I think it obviously has its highlights like Valorant and Call of Duty, and then things could be ever so slightly better in CS2 and quite a bit better in Apex. I think in Apex, the shoutiness of the gunfire, that elevation and emphasis rings through quite to a great extent in big team fights in Apex. When you start adding a third party, etc., it begins to kind of get that deer in the headlights, but a little bit better than we saw on the Ziigaat Pro, because there's not as much of this immersion, this energetic rumble out of the low end, keeping that separation and layering a little bit better, which is why it scores a little bit higher. It, again, plays quite well in Call of Duty. I do think that the gunfire is also handled a little bit better in COD in comparison to the Ziigaat Pro, but obviously something that when you start getting into layered team fights, it does detract from some of the lighter things, and just this tuning in general coming off a little bit warmer in Call of Duty. Again, quite a bit of husk on a lot of things, that it just begins to lose out and fade a little bit on certain things. But a good performer in Call of Duty, a good performer in Valorant, to say the least. So it's got, on my listing, it's going to fall into the B+ range, which is where the original Odyssey falls into. I would just say that I think the Odyssey as well as the Odyssey 2 are probably on the lower range of B+. So I'll have a notation for both that they border a B in comparison to the other things in that B+ range. That is going to be it for this one, guys. I hope it helped. If it did, please leave a sub to the channel. See you guys in the next review. Peace.